afternoon. Welcome to the Ordinance Committee meeting for the City of Santa Barbara on October 26, 2021. Ms. Crescente, if you would do a roll call, please.
Councilmember Kristen Snedden.
Here.
Mayor Pro Tem Oscar Gutierrez.
Present.
And Chair Mike Groden.
Here. So we will do public comment for items that are not on the agenda today. There's only one item on the agenda, so anything else other than that would generate public comment. Ms. Crescente, if you would lead us through noticing and see if we have anybody.
Thank you. We can click on the public comment. There we go. If you would like to make a public comment for items not on the agenda, please raise your hand within the app. Again, this is for items not on the agenda. And Chair Jordan, there's no one raising their hands at this time.
Okay, then we will move on to our item today, which is a continuation of the discussion and any action on small wireless facilities ordinance. Mr. Kalan.
Thank you, Chair Jordan, members of the committee. 2 weeks ago, when we presented the draft small wireless facilities ordinance, following public comment, we were asked to come back with the detailed application checklist. And in addition, we looked at some changes in the ordinance to improve the findings. I want to direct the committee's attention to page 24 of 88 in the ordinance, if you have it available online. If you don't have it available online, it is also page 24, but section 9.170.090. And I apologize if I'm looking away from the camera. I'm trying to look at the ordinance as well. This is the section of the ordinance that contains the necessary approval findings. And as we described in the staff report, the public commentary about improving those findings made sense to us. And so what we've done throughout is include specific reference to the authorizing sections of the ordinance that empower the staff and appellate bodies to control things like design standards, locational requirements, RF emission exposure, and required public notices. So you will see those in the improved findings in section 9.170.090. The second task we were asked to take on, I will turn to Adam Hendel to describe. That is preparing what you have as attachment 2, and that is the draft application checklist that the staff will be using, subject to changes time to time. One of the comments that I want to address head on is whether this checklist should be codified in the ordinance. As the committee knows, if we codify it in the ordinance, we can't change it without a trip to the ordinance committee with a staff report, a trip to the council, and 31 days of waiting. We envision circumstances where, due to changes in the law, that kind of delay could put the city at a great disadvantage in terms of dealing with wireless facilities. Now, why do we care about that disadvantage? Before Mr. Hendel speaks, I want to take you back to how we started 18 months ago. When council directed this project, council asked for, and we made a sincere commitment to bring back the most protective ordinance we could. And protective means two things for us. One, protective means protecting the community from the unwanted effects of wireless facilities. And as you know, our power is very strictly limited in the area of aesthetics. But protective also means preserving local control for the city council to do what's right for the community, regardless what the state or FCC might demand. I think we've hit that balance just about as well as we could. So with that as a preface, let me turn it over to Mr. Hendel to address the application checklist.
Thank you, Ariel. Adam Hendel, Principal Engineer in the Public Works Department. As Ariel said, the application checklist will be used by city staff to ensure that we get complete application from the carriers and that the applications are reviewed for compliance with the policies in the ordinance. We've also taken the opportunity to include some local requirements, such as design details on meter cabinets, traffic control requirements, things that are within the local control. And we feel that the application checklist is a good resource for all individuals, and it's included in the package should there be any comments. Thank you very much. I'll turn it over to Ariel now.
Thank you. That concludes our presentation. I should add, Chair Jordan, that during the period between the meetings, representatives of SafeTech SB proposed, and I acknowledge that I would recommend providing their legal counsel, Andrew Campanelli, with a 15-minute block to speak today, provided that the other members of SafeTech SBC were willing to cede their time. I understand they are, and so if the committee does not have specific questions at this point, I would suggest turning it over to Mr. Campanelli.
That would be great. We also thought we'd do regular public comment on this topic for non-safe tech people. When would you suggest doing that, Mr. Kalan?
I think it will be informative to hear Mr. Campanelli. So after that.
Ms. Sneddon?
Thank you, Chair Jordan. I just had a question if Mr. Kalan knows if Mr. Campanelli will be addressing the checklist, or is it just the red line of what's already been presented? Or is he an opportunity to look at the checklist as well?
He sent us comments at approximately 11:20 this morning, and he had some suggestions for the checklist. We do have a response to that, but I'd like to hear his explanation before we discuss it.
Thank you.
Great. Then we will go to Mr. Campanelli. Ms. Crisante, if you would activate, if that's the right word, and we'll let him introduce himself. And I will be doing the timing on my timer from here. And I'm sure Mr. Campanelli's done this before. 15 minutes is the time, but if you attract any questions at the end of that from ordinance committee meetings, that will not be part of your 15 minutes.
And Chair Jordan, Mr. Campanelli is no longer in the attendee list. Give me 1 second. So he is now a presenter. Mr. Campanelli, you're able to speak.
Great, thank you. Good
morning.
afternoon. Good morning. Good morning. I
Or
apologize.
afternoon, I guess. No, you're right.
Yeah, it's 3:30 here. Okay.
Yep.
Good afternoon. Well, thank you for the opportunity to speak before you. I have reviewed your most current draft of the ordinance. I reviewed it rather carefully. I've reviewed ordinances from all over the country. I will commend you. I could see that you've put a lot of work into this. You've given a lot of thought. As a litigator who's been litigating for 28 years and handling federal cases regarding the Telecommunications Act and watched thousands of applications, I do have some suggestions as to how to better vest the city with the power to control the placement of wireless facilities. First and foremost, I want to address the application requirements. I understand why council says that you do not want to codify specific application requirements in the code, because if you want to change it, it takes more time. I understand that, but I will tell you that given the current state of the law, and I will tell you that every representation, every suggestion I make to a local government of what they should add to their local ordinance is based upon federal decision making. So every time the federal judge hands down a new decision, I say, oh, this municipality turned down an application and was successfully sued because they made this mistake. So I recommend changes to ordinance number 1 to vest local governments with the maximum power to control the placement of wireless facilities, consistent with the general authority preserved to them by the Federal Telecommunications Act, and to enable them to render decisions in a manner which complies with what are largely the procedural limitations which the TCA imposes upon you. So first and foremost, with regard to your application requirements, it is critical, in my view, to either codify or put in your checklist a number of things. Number 1, you should require of any applicant, whether it's a carrier or site developer, whether or not they intend to claim that conditions exist such that a denial of their specific application would constitute an effective prohibition of wireless services. You need to know that at the outset for a number of reasons. Number 2, you should codify or at a minimum put in your checklist specific types of probative evidence that they are required to file at the time of their application. Now, I don't know if members of this board are aware of the fact that for years, there have been battles over propagation maps. For years, local governments, sophisticated ones, have recognized that for the most part, computer-generated propagation maps have the probative value of a comic strip. They mean nothing. The problem with propagation maps being submitted by wireless carriers came to a head last August, August 2020, when the FCC staff felt that propagation maps which wireless carriers had sent to the FCC were, let's say, not accurate. So the staff of the FCC conducted 10,000 miles of drive tests and conducted over 26,000 drive tests, in addition to 5,600 fixed site tests, and assessed the accuracy of propagation maps which were being submitted to the FCC by the wireless carriers. What the FCC staff determined was that the accuracy of their propagation maps ranged from a low of 16.4% to a maximum high of 64%, which means that the propagation maps that the wireless companies were given to the FCC were completely inaccurate. It's no better when they submit propagation maps to local governments. So the FCC staff recommended to the FCC that they no longer accept propagation maps without hard data. And significantly for Californians, the California Public Utilities Commission embraced that view as well and said that we should never accept computer-generated propagation maps without data. Now, earlier today, I forwarded to you an application checklist that I prepared for another government in another state. And in there, I detail the specific types of probative evidence that your director, of the public works director, should require at the outset in an application. Because if and only if they require that specific type of data, it would enable the public works director or their designee, whoever they put in charge, to ascertain if denial of a specific application would either, number 1, remedy a significant gap in personal wireless services, number 2, be the least intrusive means of remedying that gap, or number 3, would constitute an effective prohibition. And the reason this is critical is because once an applicant makes an allegation that those circumstances exist, you as a local government are prohibited from denying the application unless your denial is based upon substantial evidence. These specific application criteria require the applicant to give you the evidence you need to make that determination and to empower you to deny an application for a specific facility should you decide to do so. I'm not saying you want to deny them all, but without having that data, I can tell you any sophisticated site developer, like from a formidable company like Crown Castle or Extenet, they'll be able to ram a facility down your throat anytime they want, anywhere they want, if you don't have this data. So I respectfully submit you need to have these requirements, whether they're in your code or whether they're in your application procedural forms. Either way, you have to have them. Here's the problem with that, having them in the code. To the extent that the requirements are not codified, when an application is denied, carriers and site developers are filing lawsuits saying the board had no legal authority to request or require the production of that types of evidence because the code doesn't say they do. And federal judges have been ruling in favor of the applicants. So that's the weight on the other side of the application, on the other side of the the balance as to why you might want to put them into your application process. Other things that you're kind of missing in your code is a gatekeeper. There are multiple shot clocks, and depending upon the nature of the application, whether it's co-location, a small cell, or a large facility, there are different shot clocks that apply. There are rejection requirements. If whoever receives your applications deems an application to be incomplete, there are deadlines within which to reject the application and tell the applicant why it's complete. If the applicant submits something afterwards and you want to reject it again, there's another deadline that you must comply with. The city would be well advised to set up a gatekeeper, and I've sent you a specific provision for that. Also missing from your application, your ordinance, are any tolling provisions. Some of the most recent tolling problems that have arisen are, for example, force majeure clauses. With the COVID pandemic, many local governments could not convene their meetings in time and blew the shot clock. And their codes didn't provide for extending shot clocks due to those circumstances. Nor their codes provide extending the shot clock for environmental review or historic preservation review, in each of which case you can actually make a referral to the FCC, which is obligated to comply with NEPA and the National Historic Preservation Act on those cases where a potential installation could potentially have an adverse impact on the environment or historic property. None of those provisions are in your code. I respectfully submit you might want to consider adding them. In addition, the notice requirements appear to be somewhat lacking. I will tell you that California is respectfully the worst in the country when it comes to the irresponsible placement of wireless facilities. Florida is bad, New York City is bad, but California is the worst in terms of people calling me up and saying, hey, I woke up this morning and there's a wireless facility 8 feet outside my kitchen window, or 10 feet from my daughter's bedroom window. It is critical that you afford the nearby property owners proper written notice in advance of a facility which may be, if installed, may have an adverse impact on their properties, either in terms of adverse aesthetic impacts or reduction in property values. It appears here there's some type of public notice, but I'm not sure they get written notice by certified mail return receipt requested. I do see if an application is granted without a hearing by the director, then they have a 7-day window to file an appeal. That would be a difficult process if they never got notice. So that is also problematic. I would suggest you reconsider that. So those are the principal areas that I believe really need addressing. If the attorney for the city has any questions, I'd love to answer them. Again, I've drafted ordinances for the past 15 years, just focusing on wireless facilities. So even though the best municipal attorneys who have been drafting local zoning laws for years may not recognize all of the problems. You have a lot of really good provisions in here. You have provisions that eliminate from public rights of way utility easements, which is great because that's the #1 avenue which site developers use to be able to put wireless facilities on people's front lawns, which I fight against on a regular basis. So that's good. And there are, as I said, there are many, many good provisions. And even though your code does say that your director can go out and hire an expert if they need technical knowledge or expertise to determine if and when there's a gap. The problem, of course, is do you really want to hire an RF engineer for every single application? It's an unnecessary waste of money. Number two, how would the director know exactly what to ask that expert for? In that realm, one of the biggest problems I'm seeing right now is some of the wireless carriers want to phase out some of the current frequencies at which they provide wireless services. So you may have an area where they have complete coverage at 1100 megahertz, but they'll come in with a propagation map and data regarding 700 megahertz, which has gaps in that area. But the reality is there's no gap in service because the carriers are providing their end-use servers with service, their end-use customers with service at the 1100 megahertz. The fact that they want to discontinue it does not create a gap. So again, if you look at the specific types of reports I'm asking for in the application requirements, this will eliminate the possibility that they can basically claim to have a gap in service because there is no gap, but the frequency at which they're providing their end-use customers with coverage is not at their most preferred frequency. This becomes critical when you talk about 5G. Because, for example, if they could cover an entire neighborhood by putting up one facility or maybe two facilities 1,000 feet apart in a residential neighborhood, but they decide they want to come in with 5G, and not only that, they want to put wireless facilities every 100 feet. That means they might need a mini cell tower basically in front of every other house. And under the balancing test, a balancing of interests created by Congress under the Telecommunications Act, I would respectfully submit to you that there's no obligation to allow them to do that. Finally, I would note that I think last time I was here, somebody made a comment on my Wolf case. I brought an action in the Northern District of California to challenge the argument that to the extent that the TCA somehow preempts the ADA, at least in terms of people who have EMS sensitivity, that is untrue. That there are people, not the majority of the population, it's a minority, but there are a minority of people who have an adverse impact when they're exposed to RF radiation levels, even within the general population exposure limits. I know this because they call me all across the country. Several years ago, a number of jurisdictions, not under my guidance, started adopting provisions for ADA compliance and ADA accommodations. I did recently lose a decision in the Northern District of California where a federal judge said you cannot consider an ADA demand for reasonable accommodation when it comes to a wireless facility. I will tell you that case is being appealed to the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, and I'm somewhat cautiously optimistic that we're going to prevail. So you can do what you want in that regard. Obviously, the Northern District's court would be binding upon your district, but I don't suspect that decision is going to stand. That's just my take. So I'll leave it at that. Again, I would commend you on the work you've done thus far. I respectfully submit it could definitely stand improvement. And again, when I say improvement, I'm not talking about banning 5G. I'm not talking about banning wireless facilities. Wireless facilities in this day and age are no less necessary than sewage treatment plants. But just like sewage treatment plants, just because you need them doesn't mean you put them anywhere. When I say improvements are needed, I mean they are needed to vest the city with the maximum power to prevent the irresponsible placement of wireless facilities on a case-by-case basis to the extent that the director determines that a specific application should be denied. So with that, I thank you for the time you've allotted me. I eagerly welcome any questions any board members may have, or for that matter, council might have. So thank you again for affording me time to speak.
Thank you, Mr. Campanelli. So let's first ask ordinance committee members if they have any question, and then we'll get a wrap up from Mr. Kalan. Ms. Sneddon?
Thank you, Chair Jordan. And thank you, Mr. Campanelli, for your time. And could you repeat, you started your list and you said the first thing and then the second thing. And the first thing, if you could repeat it, I didn't want to interrupt you, but the second thing was the checklist at the time of application. And then the very first thing that you mentioned.
I believe the first thing I mentioned did have to do with the checklist and what you should require of an applicant at the outset. The first thing you should require them to acknowledge or represent to you is if in the context of their application, they're going to claim that conditions exist such that a denial of their application would effectively prohibit them from providing personal wireless services and thus would violate the Federal Telecommunications Act. Because then at the outset, your director will understand that they must do an analysis of whether or not there's a significant gap in personal wireless services at the precise location where they want to build a facility. The director will know that they must determine if the proposed facility at the specific site they want it, at the specific height they want it, is the least intrusive means of remedying that gap in service. And finally, they will know that they have to make that determination as to whether or not a denial of the application would materially inhibit the applicant, or more specifically, an identified wireless carrier from providing personal wireless services. Each of these determinations are factual determinations which your director would have the power to make. Also, your director should understand he gets to decide, he or she gets to decide what evidence they want to require the applicant to produce to enable them to make that factual determination. And your director must be made to understand under federal law your director gets to decide what weight to give any piece of evidence that the applicant submits. So by way of example, if the applicant produces a propagation map, which is computer generated and is not certified and is not accompanied by any supporting drive test data, your director can determine that that is insufficient to establish the existence of a significant gap in service. For precisely the same reasons, the FCC staff reached that same conclusion for the FCC in August of 2020.
Thank you. That helps tremendously. And then just before we take public comment and questions, just process to this point. So we've received a red line version, and then your comments today at this meeting are so thorough, and I personally need to sort of see it in writing and compare and look more thoroughly. Do we have that in writing, or is there a structured way? Yeah.
Well, I sent a section of a code I recently drafted for another jurisdiction, another state, and it lays out the application requirements. And it explains, for example, when you require an applicant to file an application and provide drive test data, they have to provide drive test data with a specific drive test data map for each frequency at which they are providing personal wireless services to their end use customers. So let's say, for argument's sake, a carrier says, we have a gap in wireless services. Here's a map showing gaps in service. What they may not disclose to you is that they're only showing their service at 670 megahertz. And at 670 megahertz, yes, there are gaps. But what they're not telling you is they also provide personal wireless services to their customers who have their phones at 1100 megahertz. And at 1100 megahertz, there are no gaps in service. So then why are they filing the application? They may be filing the application either because they want to eliminate 1100 megahertz service, or they don't need it now, but for the future, they want to put the installation in for 5G service, which, by the way, is not available yet in this neighborhood, which means as a matter of law, they can claim to have a significant gap in personal wireless service that doesn't exist. And so they can't, in essence, deceive you or provide misleading information, which I've watched for 28 years. This cuts through the nonsense. This requires them to prove actual hard data, which would enable your director to figure out if they're telling you the truth and they're giving you the whole story. In equal vein, it also requires them to give you 3 dBm bins. What does that mean? Well, let's say they're going to say, here's our level of signal strength. We have a signal strength of minus 95 dBm, and we need 95 dBm. And so here's a map of our coverage from 85 to 102. There can be a lot hidden in a map with that broad range of measurements. So most sophisticated RF engineers would require them to provide coverage maps in 3 dBm bins, meaning give me a map showing coverage at your 1100 megahertz service for minus 95 dBm to minus 98 dBm. Again, this is not rocket science. If you ask for the specific items I put in the list that I sent to each of you this morning at about 11:30, if you require them to produce that, then they have to give you the evidence which will show, number one, whether or not there is, in fact, a significant gap in personal wireless service. Number two, where those gaps or gaps are. And number three, the geographic boundaries of those gaps.
Thank you. So I just want to ask you just a logistical question, just logistical. So this is what I'm trying to piece together is where these pieces of information are. I was on my way over to City Hall at 11:30, so I have not received an email. So
I'm sorry, I sent an email, but I can send it again to any email address you want. And it's just.
That's okay. I'm just trying to understand. So there's one that has, and I'm thanking you. I don't know if it sounds like it, but I'm thanking you for all of your careful work on this. And I mean, on the face of it, I agree with all of the recommendations that you've made. It's just before making a careful consideration of that, for me personally, I need to sort of read the words. So there's an email from you, and then we also have the red line.
I
You don't-
did not send a red line. When I started reviewing this the last time, the very last time I reviewed it, I tried to sit down and draft a red line version and I couldn't because there's just the types of changes that need to be made are more than just a few words. And again, that's not to criticize the draft. Whoever drafted it put a lot of work into it. They put a lot of thought into it. They did a good job as far as they went. But again, unless you're on the front line watching these applications every day and watching applicants submit false information knowingly, and reading federal decisions every day, all day long from across the country, you're not going to recognize all the little minutiae that really need to be addressed. Because there are many cases where a local government denies an application for a perfectly valid reason, but they missed something. They failed to address in their written decision whether or not the applicant established least intrusive means. And guess what? They get sued in federal court and lose a case they should have never lost.
Thank you.
That's-
So I can understand that. So the ordinance that you sent us is sort of a fresh, modeled on ones that you've done for other cities. And that already incorporates all of these recommendations.
As far as the application process, this is just one section. This is an ordinance I drafted 2 months ago. It incorporates, it doesn't actually say it, but it incorporates the most current case law from the federal circuit courts.
Okay.
So behind the scenes,
Mr. Campanelli, can I just let you answer the question? Yes, and could we
yes,
move on?
sorry, I'm
Thank
sorry,
you.
Mr. Jordan. Yes.
Okay, and thank you. Okay, so Chair Jordan, is it my understanding that if we're looking at the most recent email from Mr. Campanelli, that ordinance would be the suggestion? I'm trying to think about what framework we're comparing to, or maybe possibly future making a motion. I'm just trying to hone in on what it is we're referring to. Maybe Mr.
So Mr. Kalan is going to weigh in on that. He was up next to respond specifically to the 2 points in the email that you have not seen and that Mr. Campanelli elaborated on, and anything else that Mr. Campanelli had to say. Ariel?
Yeah, okay, thank you.
I'm sorry, Councilmember Jordan, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
Go ahead.
Okay, Chair Jordan, members of the committee, let me clarify. Mr. Campanelli's email included a draft of additional information for the application checklist, and we will address that. He also discussed adequacy of notice. And I do want to call your attention to the August, I believe it's August 16, 2021, 42-page report that Mr. Campanelli prepared. His concern about notice was the specific type of photo simulation that the ordinance requires. He concluded by saying that the public notice provisions in proposed Chapter 9.170 are adequate, subject to the discussion regarding visual impact analysis. When you probe further, the complaint about notice was that our photo simulation requirement did not specify the angles from which those photos would come. So that's the specific concern about notice. And I'm referring to page 32 of 42 in the August 16 report that was provided earlier. As to the application requirements, in a nutshell, we believe we have the checklist requiring the information necessary to do the kind of analysis Mr. Campanelli is describing. It may not be as explicit. I'm going to turn to Trip May to explain those provisions in a way that I think will be assistive to the committee. We don't have a fundamental hostility to more detail, though.
Thank you, Oriel. Good afternoon, Chair Jordan, members of the committee. My name is Trip May. I'm your outside counsel for wireless issues. And as Oriel said, we don't have a fundamental hostility to more detail. Some of the things that I've seen in the checklist would make sense to add. I would caution us not to codify them for the reasons that Oriel explained earlier. But the basic idea of laying out more detailed requirements within a flexible application document that can continue to grow and expand as staff gets more experience or as changes in the laws occur, is what you have in front of you. And as far as the balance between what to require and when to require it, it's always good to get information up front, unless of course it may be unnecessary. So for example, the ordinance is structured in such a way that we're trying to encourage applications to go away from residences with good designs that don't mar the city's streetscape. If we get those types of applications, we don't need so much additional information. And if we get applications in locations we don't like, or with designs that we don't like, then it does make sense to probe further. As far as asking whether the site would cause an effective prohibition or not, I think the answer you'll get is always going to be yes. A more targeted question within the context of the ordinance you have in front of you might be in the application asking whether the applicant plans to pursue an exception, meaning that their project can't comply with the city's requirements, and they believe that there's federal or state preemption involved. And then if that's the case, then we go into the laundry list of additional and more specific detailed requirements that Mr. Campanelli has described. And I'll be available for any questions on that point if you have them.
And I have a recommendation as to process, Chair Jordan, Councilmember Sneddon. If the committee accepts our recommendation that the application checklist not be codified so that we can change it quickly as needed, we would be happy to prepare an amplified draft that addresses Mr. Campanelli's concerns in time for the city council to review it with this ordinance. It has been a year and a half. The one thing we're fairly strongly recommending against is another attachment to Mr. Campanelli's 11:20 a.m. email, and that is a specific set of rules on how to deal with the so-called shot clock. That amounts to a procedural trap for us. We will be well aware of how to handle the shot clock, and the staff will be well instructed, and the law may change in that area. So again, it's an area where we believe flexibility is more important than having a codified set of rules.
Very good. Ms. Sneddon, anything specific to this, or do you want to go on to public comment and then get back to this?
Yeah, just quickly, thank you, Chair Jordan, about the noticing. I read it to be more than just the what Mr. Kalan was saying there, that the noticing, I mean, I think we talked last time about 7 days versus 15 days versus whether you're getting mailed notifications or just a posted notification. So I think there's more. I just want to clarify that part of that, the notifications would be more than just.
Can we just hold that for a second and come back to it?
Sure.
And just kind of get public comment. I've got questions on the noticing and who it goes to also. So I think we're gonna wander through that checklist kind of much. So okay. So
and I have one more question about tolling provision. Should I hold that too?
Yeah,
Can you?
Okay, thanks. Mr. Sante, so let's wander through public comment for those that are lined up there and see if anybody is interested in public comment.
Thank you, Chair Jordan. Holly, if you can bring up our public comment slide. Thank you. For those who would like to make a comment on this item, please raise your hand within the app. Not at this time, Chair Jordan. Nobody has raised their hand.
Okay, that was easy. So Ms. Sneddon, I'll cue you up first.
Thank you, Chair Jordan. So I suppose I have, so now we're in questions and comments.
As
what anything goes.
You get 49 minutes if you want it. Yep.
Okay. Well,
No pressure.
I'm not sure what order. We've received this list of questions, which I think are all really good questions. And I'm not sure if we want to go through those one at a time. Or if, and those just came today as well. So there's a lot that's to digest here from the last 24 hours. I do, in general, agree with that all the recommendations that Mr. Campanelli laid out, actually, and they've been in conversation. We've been hearing these suggestions and recommendations for over a year and a half. And this was just the final sort of enumeration of them. But and the checklist, I would like it to be codified. I think there's importance to that. And when we want to, we're able to change things pretty quickly. I'm not seeing that as a detraction. I think that we can do it. If we have a list to work with, then we could change it quickly if we needed to, but not to have anything there. I'm not comfortable with that. And I think that the public might not be comfortable with that either. The tolling provisions I have questions about. Definitely adding historic provisions. The notice requirements that I think we talked last time about making that notice window longer. So I still would like to make that notice window longer. And to Mr. Tripp's comments about not wanting to have extra regulations. You know, if this were something like trying to get a business going or something like that, I would second guess whether we needed more regulations on it. But this is something that has the potential to affect people's quality of life in different ways. And so I think, it's a communications tower, and once they're in and approved, I think it's more difficult to move them. So I don't have a problem with having extra regulations on them. And I think it's actually a good idea. So I guess I'll just frame those. I would like these individual questions that we received this morning to be generally addressed, but I don't know how you want to manage that. There are a lot of different, questions here.
Mr. Kalan, so I guess I have some questions too, but I guess those questions are more like a work list. So I guess I'd ask you, after hearing that, what kind of response you have, if you can fly your way through that, or does it require some time to address specifically the stuff that came in the last day?
I'd like to begin with notice, and we can look at the other questions. Many of the questions are rhetorical, and I'm not going to respond to those. The ordinance provides explicitly that notice goes by mail within 10 days of the application being received to everyone within 500 feet. It also includes provision for additional notice for people within 1,000 feet. That's in section 9.170.030 Z. I feel that given the shot clock, the 10-day notice after the application is received is really quite ample. But changing that, what you would do is require notice earlier. And so we're really only talking about a 10-day difference. And is it feasible to send notice on the same day an application is received? Probably not. So 10 days really appears to be the minimum time for us to develop a list of everyone living within 500 feet and get notices mailed. I do want to come back, though, to Mr. Campanelli's August 2021 report. He said in no uncertain terms that our notice provisions were adequate. What he was concerned with is that they did not include a specific mandate that the photo simulation include views from neighboring homes. That is certainly possible, provided the people in the neighboring homes are willing to allow some sort of intrusion to create those photographs. But we are requiring photo simulations for each application. In terms of the application checklist, we will, and I respect your position, Councilmember Sneddon. We will continue to recommend against that to the City Council. The application checklist is no different than the checklist the Community Development Department is required to prepare under state law. And those changes happen with some frequency. Again, we're happy to amend it further to include more detail about propagation maps, but it would really be strongly inadvisable to lock that into the code. The reason being the shot clock is so short that we will end up being forced to approve applications that no one wants if we are stuck with a locked in stone application checklist. And frankly, it presumes some antagonism between the City Council and staff, which doesn't exist. As I said at the outset, we're here to serve you, and our goal and frankly our successful product has presented the most protective ordinance that we can. And I think that's evidence because when you get down to it, Mr. Campanelli has 2 or 3 concerns at this hour. So if you would like to go through the questions one by one, ask them, and then Tripp, May, Mr. Hendel, and myself will take them as we are able. I tried to avoid this, by the way, and the committee knows this, by several means. First of all, we invited a red line. We invited a PowerPoint. We asked for a PowerPoint to be available by noon yesterday. We asked for an ordinance as soon as possible, but preferably by the 21st so that we could analyze it. So I have to say it's not for lack of trying that we don't have the ability to respond to these questions. And I also want to say in that vein, because I do feel defensive about it, we've learned a lot from the public and Mr. Campanelli. It's been extraordinarily valuable to the city. So I deeply appreciate the work they've done. But in sum, I think we're down to just a few little points. And perhaps the most important of those is the deficiency that Mr. Campanelli is identifying with propagation maps. And his proposed revision to the application checklist is a way of greatly beefing up or making more specific the kind of information an applicant will have to provide if they are claiming they have either an exception or an effective prohibition. So that is well worth following up, and we appreciate that comment.
Can I just say, Mr. Jordan, Chair Jordan, Mr. Klon, there are a few things that you said in there that I just need to comment on. First, thank you. Thank you, and Mr. Doymes in particular, for working so closely and following this up. You said about being defensive, and there's no need to be defensive at all, and about there being a perceived animosity between the council and staff. And I just want a checklist. There's no emotional animosity attached to it, and I don't really want that to be part of the conversation. And I think that having a checklist protects the public, and sometimes there are different council members or different staff members who are in agreement or who are not in agreement, and this checklist eliminates that issue in my mind. And I think it's I hear what you're saying, and I hear that you don't agree with that, and that's fine, but it has nothing to do with any kind of feeling of animosity at all. I do think this should have the historic provisions in there for historic districts, and I'll leave it at that. I feel very strongly there needs to be a checklist, even if it says in compliance with the current state checklist, or has additional provisions for historic provisions or anything like that. I think it needs to be clear, consistent, transparent, and checklists help that, helps with transparency and predictability. And I'll leave it at that.
But Councilmember Sneddon, please, I want to apologize. I was not suggesting there was any animosity here. What I was saying is we have a checklist. The issue is whether the council should bake that checklist into the ordinance. That's the portion that we have concern with. And what I was elaborating is that requiring the checklist to be locked into the ordinance presumes, at least by inference, that the staff needs to be controlled by 4 votes in 31 days. That, if the council wishes to do that, you certainly can, but I can almost guarantee that we will have applications that are approved by virtue of automatic approval under the shot clock, when in the future cities have more power or less power, and we can't implement that power under a checklist without council approval. So that was all I was saying. I completely understand your point, and I just want to make it clear that we do have a checklist. And what I had suggested was that the draft presented today could be amended. Now, if the committee wishes to keep this, we can amend it and bring it back for your review. Or, as I suggested, we could amend it and take it to council for the full council's review. So my apologies, I didn't mean to confuse things.
Stay there. I have a couple questions for you, Mr. Kalan. I'll get my questions out of the way. I guess the softball is, if we continue to move this forward and do nothing, what's the on the ground result right now?
We have little, if any, control at the current time.
And installations are going in as we speak, right?
I would assume that to be true.
Okay. And then can you talk to me a little bit about the appeal structure? I'm just worried about this becoming an appeal fest, so to speak. So if you go through the process scientifically and it meets the propagation, it meets the RF concerns with science and data, it meets the coverage information with science and data, and someone wanders in and wants to appeal it based on RF information, do we stop the appeal in its tracks there, or does that appeal still get to come to council?
We would advise the city clerk not to accept the appeal in a couple of circumstances. At page 26 of the ordinance, in section 9.170090 D as in Delta, under appeals, the code says that an interested person can appeal. However, it goes on to say that appeals from an approval shall not be permitted when based on reasons otherwise compliant under this chapter, including specifically appeals based on pre-approved designs or the environmental effects of RF emissions. So those appeals would come to the city clerk would seek our advice, and we would advise the applicant that appeals of that nature are not permitted. The reason for that is not to shorten anybody's workload, it's to avoid appeals over matters we cannot control under state or federal law.
Understood. And when you say whatever it was, shall or will not be permitted, staff is making that call and declining to accept an appeal, correct?
That is how I read it. Mr. May appears to have a comment.
I,
Mr. May.
thank you, Ariel. I just wanted to make it clear that the provision in the proposed ordinance that bars appeals based on RF effects is not an absolute bar to appeals based on RF effects. It only prohibits appeals based on the environmental effects of radio frequency emissions that are compliant with the FCC standards. So if the appeal was to say that this facility does not comply with the FCC standards, that's an appeal that could go forward. But anything other than that, based on the environmental effects of radio frequency emissions, is preempted under federal law, and so the appeal would be wasted effort.
And so stay right there, Mr. May. So if you're compliant with federal law in regards to RF emissions, but I think Mr. Campanelli in his email, one of his emails referenced his success at, if I look out my front window and see a RF antenna on top of a light pole across the street, that we should successfully be able to deny that, to not have that happen in any residential neighborhood.
Mhm.
So if I'm having trouble grasping if there's no RF, if there's no science-based appeal available there, how is it, and you've met all the other criteria, you found the least intrusive place, your propagation map or coverage data clearly shows it. How is it that that becomes an aesthetic issue that you can control just by somebody being somewhere and looking at something that's a development? In this case, it's not a structure, it's not a car, but it's an antenna on a pole. Does that make sense?
I think within the context of your hypothetical question, the person who's looking out their window wanting to file an appeal is probably basing it on what is an inherently subjective portion of the code that's proposed in front of you, like whether this is the least intrusive means. So perhaps they disagree with the determination that there are no other less discouraged areas for this facility, or that there is no better way of concealing the equipment that's being placed on the pole. And those would be permissible grounds for an appeal under this proposed ordinance.
So in theory, the first part you said that, so it's my house and I'm looking out, I could appeal it, and there's probably a radius of application of areas there. So in a sense, all I'm doing is steering it in front of the next pole and somebody else in front of somebody else's house, and they would appeal it, and so on and so on. And you'd move this thing around in theory, hypothetically, until you just found the edge of where there was nowhere else to put it based on coverage data and strength, even if that was in front of somebody's window, right?
Well, ideally, we're not doing that in the appeal process.
Okay.
Ideally, the locations preferences and the discouraged locations are structured in a way that they don't go in front of anybody's front yard window. They don't go into the foot of anybody's driveway. They are pushed away from those locations to the maximum extent that they possibly can be, consistent with the material inhibition standard under the FCC's regulations. We do that at the staff level. And if then there are disagreements about whether that has been done appropriately or if there's been something that's overlooked, then the appeal process exists to allow, affected or interested persons to weigh in again. And we've built it with the staff decision first, followed by an appeal, so that we have time under the shot clock to give a public hearing whenever one is asked for by the public. We don't have enough time for every public hearing for every site, but when we want to give at least the opportunity for when people really want one, they can ask for one.
Okay, thanks. And then Mr. Hendel, if you're still hanging on there, I think I have one question that I'm gonna ask a couple different ways, I think. So there's multiple sections in the checklist section that talk about, I'll just list some examples. Give me the manufacturer and the model number. The whole fire safety section, surge protection, automatic turn off, 1 hour fire resistant, that kind of thing. Are those requirements on public poles and public right-of-ways in force for Edison or Cox or anybody else that's using those poles? So say, for example, an Edison transformer. does an Edison transformer have fire extinguishing equipment on it? Does it have an automatic turn off? Does it have a noticing, like a central station alarm when whatever happens to it?
So, Chair Jordan, let me answer that question more broadly, and we can get in the specifics. In terms of other public utilities, such as Edison on transformers and things like that, that is level of detail that the City Public Works staff don't get into. Those are the things that are governed by the California Public Utility Commission rules of poles and transformers. When it comes to this this checklist and these requirements, these are areas that certain elements of which we can review and inspect. And there's certain details in the checklist on manufacturers and models of certain things that are on the plans that we look at in more detail than others. But it sounds like you had some specific questions related to some of those parts.
Well, but your answer is that the PUC gives Edison its ability to put what they want, what they want on top of a pole, in my example, in terms of going blank on what I just called it, a transformer, and that we have no say in threat to human life, health, or safety in terms of if that blows up, catches on fire, doesn't have a noticing, doesn't self-extinguish. That's all governed by the PUC.
That is correct.
Okay, but we do have a say specifically on that for small cell installations.
That is correct.
And let me be a little more specific. Councilmember Jordan, page 59 of the ordinance describes specific fire safety standards, including a shutoff available to fire personnel, surge protection capable of mitigating lightning, surge protection capable of mitigating electrical disturbances that enter via conductive cables, at least 1 hour fire resistant interior services, and monitored automatic fire notification and extinguishing systems for all small wireless facilities.
And these are uniquely available to us because they're not governed by the PUC like an Edison product would be, correct?
Chair Jordan, in more simple terms, these small cell facilities have electrical services provided by the other public utilities. And so we have some inspection authority to release that equipment. So from a standpoint of a public utility, the small cell facilities are a little bit different than, say, a traditional Edison power pole.
Hi, okay. Hi, Mr. May.
And hello again. Let me put a finer point on it. The answer is yes. So wireless facilities in California are telephone corporations for the purposes of the Public Utilities Code. So that makes them a utility. But not all utilities in California are created the same, especially when they are competitive, profit-seeking entities that don't have franchising at the local level. So that is a big difference between, say, the water company, the sewer company, or even the electric company and wireless carriers on the other side. So the regulations are different. And this is one of those instances where we have at the local level a little bit more control than we would for other types of utilities.
And Mr. May, we're not making these things up. They're done already in other places successfully, right?
Correct.
Okay. Thanks. So just a couple of comments, I guess. So we had about 20 minutes. It seems like this will need to come back, and I guess my comment to that would be, I'm looking at my sideways at my calendar. It's going to be January, and I guess I just want to make that that point to the rest of the committee. It will not be the 16th or the 9th, as we already have ordinance committee items scheduled for those days. We're off the 2nd, the 23rd, and the 30th. So we'll come back. I'm sorry, come back in December, not January. I'm skipping ahead of my 3-month calendar. So the earliest they would come back would be early December if we haven't already stacked up. So I guess the point I'm making, it would be another 30 days. That might be good. There's plenty of time to put a work list together and get it to staff on what you would like to see. Comments, Ms. Sneddon?
Thank you, Chair Jordan. I think at different points in this conversation, we've maybe thought we only had 1 or 2 points left to hone in on, and other times where it seemed more far ranging. And I'm wondering if we could spend a little time before we end really focusing on what it is that we hope might be different when we see it again or not.
I think that you have the most comprehensive list for that, I think. So let me just let you take as much time as you want. And I know Mr. Kalan will be noting.
If I might, just very briefly, Councilmember Sneddon, before you start on historic, we do identify as one of the most discouraged locations any place within 250 feet of an historic resource.
Okay. Thank you. So it's actually not, I don't have a really huge list. It's pretty small, and I think hopefully we can get this done before January. And I do think that, and we'll, I don't know how the committee feels about this. So, but if we're not in agreement, it can wait till it goes to council. But I do think the checklist at the time of application is a good idea. I do like the sort of discretion of the Public Works Director. Just making sure that the historic provisions, but it sounds like they are in place. And I'd like the noticing window to be as long as possible. I understand that might have, mean noticing earlier, but just whatever the possibility for that is for noticing. Sometimes a person gets a notice and they're out of town for more than 10 days. And they come back, you take a 2-week vacation, you come back and you have a wireless conveyor outside your bedroom window, and you didn't even know that was going to happen. So I'm just sensitive to that with neighbors, and I want to do whatever we can for that. And I think it sounds like for the gaps in service, that needs to be just really clear on what we're considering and what data we're considering for gaps of service. I think if it's discretionary, or, we've heard a lot of different things about how that might be defined, how that might be measured, and if it's according to the FCC, current regulations, and you can't appeal. But this gaps in service is a really big question. Is it measured by an individual driving around getting a gap in service? Is it provided by the provider? Is the city responsible for finding that out? And the definition of significant gap in service, right now, if I'm driving around Mission Canyon, there are places where I get no service within my own house. When I'm walking around, there are places I get no service. I would still not consider that significant gap in service myself. So I think there's too much room for different interpretations of what significant gap of service means and how it's measured. And I think that's it. It's really small. I really just want the checklist, and to have the notification window be as big as possible, and to have the Public Works Director have some discretion there too. But that's it, really.
Mr. Kalan, could I have you, and I'll just tell you both, I'm getting prompted, we have 5 minutes because of the switch today at council from GoTo to Zoom for SBTV. So let's see if we can finish in 5, or we'll continue the conversation. We'll finish in 5 with a recommendation, or finish it another time. Go ahead.
I took my best notes with Council Member Sneddon's concerns. I want to clarify with respect to gaps in service, we expressed our willingness to include Mr. Campanelli's proposal in the application checklist, which the committee has reviewed today. There are 2 ways to do that, we can bring it back to the committee or we can bring it to the city council. So we concur that the checklist is a good idea. We agree that as to gaps in service, we want to empower the director to have as much discretion as possible. The ordinance currently protects historic resources within 250 feet. That leaves the noticing window. And I am happy to try and sharpen our pencil to make that as long a period as possible so that people aren't surprised, remembering that this is a direct mailed notice. So I think it's really just a couple of issues, and it's your pleasure whether you would like to see it again or otherwise. Thank you.
Are you confident that you could successfully bring those revisions to council obviously sooner than you would go back to ordinance and then to council, but from a workload standpoint, you'd be happy with taking those directly to council before we opine on that?
That's really up to you. I believe I understand Council Member Snedden's concerns, and I believe that we can address them effectively between now and council. However, if you'd like to see it again, that's appropriate as well.
Ms. Snedden?
I think with those changes, and it sounds like concurrence, then I think it can go right to council after those have been addressed. Yeah.
Okay. Want to make a motion?
Sure. I will make a motion that with those adjustments, that we would forward this to council with our recommendation.
I second that. Thank you. Ms. Crisante, I think we can call a roll call vote.
Thank you, Chair Jordan. So we are moving recommendation with additions that Councilmember Snedden has added, which is a checklist at the time of application, discretion of the Public Works Director, historic provisions in place, noticing window to be as long as possible, and gaps in service. It was moved by Councilmember Snedden to move to council, seconded by Councilmember Oscar Gutierrez. Oscar Gutierrez?
I would say gaps in service defined.
Gaps in service to be defined.
I kind of just wrote down all that Hertz stuff, right? Yeah.
Ready to vote?
Yep.
Councilmember Oscar Gutierrez.
Aye.
Sorry, Mayor Pro Tem Oscar Gutierrez. Councilmember Snedden
Yes.
and Chair Jordan.
Yes. All right. We will see that at some point for a long discussion at council, I'm sure. And that's Mr. Khan?
With your permission, Chair, I'd like to thank the Ordinance Committee. This has been hard work, and the work you've done has been extraordinarily helpful to the community as well as to your staff. I'd also like to extend my thanks to the members of the public who have worked long and hard to help us with this. Thank you for allowing me to do that.
And of course, you'll get thanks later, but the city attorney's office, you and Mr. Duemas, of course, too, have done yeoman's jobs on this, both internally and externally, as always. So, all right, we will then be adjourned until our next meeting, but we'll see you at the 2 o'clock meeting for council. Thanks.